Welcome to Action Design Radio, podcast of the Action Design Network, a globally recognized nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting all aspects of behavioral science. From hosting educational events to developing industry resources, the Action Design Network brings together individuals to build communities around behavioral science. Our members are a diverse group of individuals who unite around one common goal, sharing a passion for the behavioral sciences and their practical applications to make a better world for all. Our guests on the Action Design Radio podcast are leading researchers and practitioners who discuss with our podcast hosts Zarak Khan and Eric Johnson how people can utilize behavioral science in order to improve their lives, their careers, and their understanding of our world and the people in it. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy today's episode.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Action Design Radio. I am usually your host, Zarak Khan, but today's episode is a little bit of a special one. We're launching a new book called Building Behavioral Science in an Organization. And so for this special kind of launch podcast, we have two guests with us. First is Laurel Newman. She and I were co-editors of the book. And Chris Nave. So Chris is the managing director of the University of Pennsylvania's Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences program. So Chris is actually going to host this episode and interview me and Laurel. So that'll be a fun change of pace. Chris, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Zarak. These are big shoes to fill with Zarak and Eric normally doing the hosting duties. Excited to be here and to chat about this really awesome book and resource for everyone. I wanted to start off by introducing Zarak's co-editor for this book, Laurel Newman, and invite her to talk a little bit more about her background and why she wanted to get involved in this project.
Sure. So my background is in psychology. I have a PhD in social and personality psychology. And I was a professor for about 12 years. And then a few years ago, decided to leave academia and go into industry to try to kind of apply the things that I had learned over the years of teaching into something where I could kind of have more of a direct influence over people's lives. So I took a job at Merritt's as an applied behavioral scientist. And that's where Zarak and I met and were colleagues on kind of a dream team of behavioral science and innovation there. And that was a really awesome opportunity. Merritt's is a business-to-business company, so we got to do behavioral science in lots of different ways and see lots of different ways to think about it. So now I'm a behavioral scientist at Edward Jones, and I will say it's a really different experience. We're kind of doing behavioral science more with employees in mind right now and customers of our own. And so the different career opportunities and experiences that I've had have really helped me to think about lots of different versions of behavioral science. And that's why this book was really interesting. Plus, working with Zarak is always, I would pay, I would pay to work with Zarak. So how can you say no?
That's great. And we can ask later whether or not you actually did pay to get involved in this. It's quite a journey and career arc. So I started off in personalized social psychology too, and just to see what you have done with that, from going from teaching to being involved in a BDB and what you're doing at Edward Jones, and bringing all of that knowledge into kind of curating this resource, I think is really, really great to see where you've gone and what could happen with this. So Zarak, can you tell a little bit more about why you thought this project was something that you wanted to do and get moving on, and why now?
Yeah, it's something that we've been thinking about for probably a few years at this point. And I'd say that it really kind of developed alongside the growth of Action Design Network, our nonprofit. So Action Design Network was founded in 2012 by Steve Wendell. And when it was first founded, it was sort of an affinity group, grew to be a lot of different city chapters of people who, it was a mix, but broadly it's kind of just a general interest in behavioral science. And that's still sort of the biggest audience out there, is folks that, they've read Predictably Rational or Nudge or something like that, or they've seen, some interesting TED Talks, and they want to learn more about, okay, how does that apply in this certain context? And that's what the bulk of our efforts have gone towards over the past few years. is sort of building that community and providing things to sort of expand that group. So that's sort of why we did this podcast. That's why we did a lot of those in-person events. But, within the past, say, five years or so, there's been a lot of growth of just applied behavioral science, like more roles, people that are doing those jobs. And so there are sort of two different communities of people that we try to have expanded different things for. It. I think of the second group of people are the ones that they've read all of these books about behavioral science, and they've gone to a lot of these talks. Maybe they've gone to some conferences or some weekend trainings, that sort of thing. And they really want to turn this into their career or a more substantial part of their career. And so they're looking for opportunities to do that. And then there is sort of this smallest group, but rapidly growing, that is comprised of people who are applied behavioral scientists. So it's folks like Laurel and myself, right? So, Laurel is the behavioral scientist at Edward Jones, and the responsibilities and the challenges and the opportunities are totally different, and the questions that you have are really different. So it's less about what's some new interesting nudge or cognitive bias out there, and more about how do I operationalize this body of knowledge within an organization. So one of the driving reasons for this book was to provide a resource to those folks. And the other is just that there are more of those people now. So we know a lot. I mean, this is kind of like a book written by all of our friends. So, not all of our friends, but lots of our friends, people that we know in the field who are doing awesome work in certain domains and have developed expertise that they were excited to share. So, when we started reaching out to folks, people were pretty immediately on board with it because they saw the value. And as is the case with a lot of behavioral science, folks were just pretty generous with their time and their expertise.
It's really great. And I think why I got excited about this particular project is our Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences program at Penn. We're graduating a lot of amazing students at various stages of their career, and they're embarking in this interdisciplinary field as analysts and strategists and consultants in different domains. And there's that what next, what happens with our alumni, and particularly those that have had years of experience, and maybe they're being asked to build a behavioral unit or organization. And there, at least in my mind, there have not been a lot of resources out there. There's been a lot of anecdotal information that's been shared among different groups. And this seems to be a way of centralizing that information by providing case examples from people that are out in the field. In terms of like the structure behind this book, is that what you are aiming for, is trying to get, what is this book about, and what kind of framework or organization are you trying to get out of this when you built this, Zarak?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So, I mean, I think there's sort of two main audiences for this book. So one of them is exactly who you just described. So it's somebody that has been tasked with building behavioral science in an organization. And I would include people in that who they might be the first behavioral science hire within that company. Pretty quickly, what those folks often learn is that their skill set is in high demand. And so they might have been hired onto, an analytics team or a marketing team, but pretty soon they're being asked to weigh in on strategy decisions or product decisions. So that's certainly kind of one audience for this. And then the other one is the person that hired that first behavioral hire. So that's maybe like a VP of marketing or a chief innovation officer, somebody who has learned enough about behavioral science to find it interesting. Well, one of the things that's sort of not in this book is like, there isn't a lot of like, this is sort of what behavioral science is. It's assumed that you kind of have read enough of that stuff. You're interested in actually building it at this point. So it's more operational, but it's a little bit of a guide for if you are a marketing lead or you lead a data science team, what should you be thinking about of how behavioral science might be integrated into your work? How might you go about doing that? And kind of importantly, I think as well, what are the limitations of that? So what should you not expect from, hiring a behavioral scientist in?
I think that's really great, that kind of the nature of calibrating expectations for senior leadership, in addition to providing that roadmap. Laurel, to you on kind of what is this book and who's the audience? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's funny because as I was working on it, I was thinking more about kind of senior leaders who are thinking, okay, I know there's a lot in HBR about behavioral science. I know there's a lot of capacity for it to help our company, but I have no idea how. I don't know where they would go. I don't know what they would do. I don't know how they would integrate. And so I was really thinking about those business leaders who are thinking, okay, we went through this maybe 10 years ago with data science. What is data science? How many people do I need? Where do I put them? And now it's kind of happening with behavioral science. And so this is kind of a guide. There really aren't a lot out there. So this is kind of a guide that helps people just kind of know what some of the core capabilities are that a behavioral scientist would do. A behavioral scientist's capabilities aren't limited to the things we talk about in the book, but those are some common places where you might kind of see or put people.
That's great, really great. And I think to that point about kind of audience and kind of the reach of this book and this resource, it's available for free or at a reduced cost depending on the resource. And it's something that Action Design and our Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences program are really passionate about being involved in. Why was it important to you, Zarak, to make this resource available widely to a bigger audience?
Yeah, it's been part of our mission really at Action Design since the beginning, has been to sort of democratize the field and make it more accessible. I mean, it really started in academia, and there are, a variety of barriers for people because of that. And so pretty early on, we made a point of, if we had events, our events were free, or if for some reason, it cost money for us to put it on, we always sort of made sure that we either found sponsors or did something to make it as inexpensive for people so that anyone who wanted to could join and learn and feel like they were a part of the community. That was part of why we started a podcast too. I mean, for a while we did like a sort of national, like big conference. And even though we kind of tried to apply the same sort of principles there of, get sponsors and make it as inexpensive and accessible as possible, like there are limitations of like, you have to physically be there to participate. And so we tried to find things that make it easier for people to connect, right? So that was sort of the idea with the podcast, and the same with the book. So part of it is just that it really wouldn't exist without the generosity and the expertise of all of the authors as well. And so we sort of did this initiative under the umbrella of Action Design, knowing that it's kind of baked into the mission that we'll try to make it as accessible as possible. So you're right, there is a free digital version that you can download from our website, action-design.org. And then just knowing that people, some people like a physical copy or want to read it on a Kindle, and just also for a broader reach, we have versions that are on Amazon as well. So you can buy, a paperback, but even those are they're priced at cost, I think. So it's like $6 or $7 or something like that for the paperback. So that was the thinking behind it. So very grateful to Action Design for that sort of being kind of part of the mission, and that sort of being blessed by our board and leadership, as well as to Penn and the MBDS program for sponsoring the effort to make that a reality.
That's great. I think widely disseminating this information and goes a long way to helping the field and leaders who are embarking in this or who are creating units, gives them more tools at their disposal. Laurel, if you can kind of expand a little bit more on your contribution to the piece, what you've kind of learned through this process by kind of, you added your own chapter in addition to being an editor, like you have your own chapter in the book, and you are in your role at Edward Jones and where you have come from, you're bringing a lot of experience. I'm wondering like what you've learned out of this process, by consulting with other chapter authors.
Gosh, I learned a lot. I would say some of the things that I hadn't really thought about, that weren't as top of mind before writing this book or editing this book with Zarak. One is just how differently people approach their jobs. So we talk about, behavioral science as a field, but behavioral science is kind of an umbrella term. And underneath that, there's so many different ways to do it. There's behavioral economics, there's all different kinds of psychology, and there's marketing. And, so if you were to take like 10 authors from this book and ask them like what behavioral science is, you'd probably get 10 different answers as they kind of dig more deeply than that into their answer. Same thing with behavioral science research. I'm kind of noticing a lot of behavioral scientists are pretty passionate about the fact that science is like a verb. You do science. And so if you hire a behavioral scientist, the reason that you hire them is to test things, to run experiments, to run A/B tests, you know, to answer with empirical data, what's the best way to go on a business decision. But having worked in the industry, I can tell you that that is often not what people think they're hiring. They often think they're hiring someone who has the answers because they have read everyone else's research. So, you know, we're hiring you to improve the functionality of this thing and to improve these outcomes, whether it's like sales or employee experience or whatever. And you're supposed to have the answers because you know behavioral science, you know people and what makes them tick, right? So that's like a tension that I think people need to be aware of in the field. It's difficult to integrate into a broad organization and know what kind of research is going to work for them and how you can help with that, and sort of, I guess, like kind of double dutch into what they're already doing, which is usually, you know, unless you're part of a big behavioral science team, you're going to have to kind of integrate into what they're already doing. So I don't know, that was sort of a distinction that hadn't been top of mind for me. The difference between, like Zarak and I have talked about, is behavioral science as a noun, which is like the content that people think you're going to apply to solve their problems, versus behavioral science as a verb, which is like the process of running experiments and collecting data to uncover what works in this context. That was a big one. And then I'll also say that the beginning of part 3 of the book on different ways to structure teams yielded some really interesting insights, like hearing from people who had actually been on different kinds of teams, like the centralized and the integrated teams, like what some of the pluses and minuses are for that, because there's a pretty heavy cost if you kind of go down one road or the other and it doesn't work out for you.
That's great. And just for the listeners to kind of get a grasp of like what's featured in this book and some of the authors, contributing authors. I mean, we have people like Chief Behavioral Officer Charlotte Blank from Merritt's. We've got Steve Wendell from Morningstar, Namika Sagara, who was at Ipsos and is now at Syntonic. Eric Johnson, the co-host of the show, has a chapter. We've got Linnea Gandhi, Scott Young, Kristen Berman, and others. So with that kind of diverse cast coming from different perspectives, what really jumps out to you, Zarak, on what you learned in putting these different perspectives and voices together?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo a lot of what Laurel just said, in that there is a lot of variety, both in terms of what people are, how people use behavioral science, and then maybe a not super surprising companion to that statement is that people are asked to do a lot of really different things. So it's not necessarily a huge surprise that people have kind of focused on different areas or come up with sort of slightly different ways of approaching things, because they just get asked to do a lot of different things. I think it speaks to really kind of the multifaceted nature of behavioral science. And it sort of, I think, brings into focus the importance of you as a behavioral scientist being able to navigate your work or projects or your organization. I like the visual of like double dutch. You kind of have to jump in and you sort of have to both sort of feel out the rhythms of, you know, what's already going on here, what's the culture of this place, what are the priorities of this organization, as well as like, where does my contribution sort of have the biggest impact? Because I think a lot of times you might be asked a really specific question. Well, actually, there's typically two ways. You're either asked a hyper specific question or you're asked an incredibly broad question. So it's like, how do I get more people to click on this button on this web page? And you have to sort of decide, is that even the most important thing to focus on, you know, or is it something kind of upstream of that? Or you are asked like, how do I get someone to do something? And it's just like incredibly broad and you have to sort of narrow the scope. So that's a pretty valuable skill. And I think you can see in the, you know, the contributions from these different authors that they have their own sort of ways of approaching this and their own sort of tools and methodologies that they've developed and how it sort of fits in with their different practice areas.
I get really excited about this too, because academia tends to be very siloed, where you kind of, you lose that ability to discuss across disciplines, how you're understanding human behavior or decision-making or any of these different processes. And you've been able to select a group of contributors that can provide these different perspectives. They come with different trainings and backgrounds. And I think in a field of applied behavioral science, where in many ways it's been around for forever, but there's kind of this is branded as behavioral science. In order for it to be successful, it cannot be a fad. And for it to really be standing, that applied behavioral science is about understanding behavior change from different perspectives and getting different voices involved. Having a resource like this that's free and accessible to everybody is, again, another big reason why I think our program and why I really wanted to get involved in and really kind of help, uplift and promote what's going on, because it's so important to have that. And at the same time, calibrate expectations so that it's not a fad, so that senior leadership gives a long enough time for these groups and units to build appropriately, and that the fate of behavioral science doesn't fall on one person in an organization. And so, in some ways, this might be a really useful companion piece for people to kind of help them, advance in their particular organization, and to have advocates assisting with them. Laurel, I wonder how you'd react to how this book can best be used by people who are kind of downloading it or purchasing the paperback of this.
Yeah, I guess it depends on kind of who they are and what they're looking to get out of it. I appreciate that the authors, I think, were pretty, in many cases, candid with like things that were sort of surprising to them or things that are often misunderstood. In most chapters, we had sort of a like limitations of behavioral science in this area that the person would be writing about, which I think is really important. Because oftentimes the limitations are just contextual, they're in the environment. And so are leaders on board? Is there a budget for it? Can we hire a team, or is it just one person? Can we integrate with data scientists to see kind of more advanced connections between other kinds of research that might be happening? I think it's good if you're a business leader to be trying to read the book and think about it sort of systemically. Like, one thing that we don't really ever talk about in the book, but that is really, well, we talk about it sort of in a different way, but nothing in the book just is meant to get totally picked up and dropped down in your organization. Just like behavioral science, like the application of this is going to differ depending on your organization, on their goals and the context, and what is the most important thing for your company to accomplish? Where does your revenue come from? How is your organization structured? So what works for one company in a really wonderful way might not be what works for another company. So that might kind of go without saying, but I think that's really important. And there is a network of people. The authors in this book are some of them. There's a growing network of people who do this for a living and who are happy for them, I think would be happy to talk to people as they're trying to figure out, I know people often reach out to me and say, like, we're looking to build a team, or we don't know how to, this is what our business is like. Would it make sense to have behavioral scientists here? If nothing else, like, I wouldn't say you read this book and then you're good to go. Like, exactly what to do to hire a team, but it gives you like sort of raises the questions and gives you some beginning answers that help you kind of go down the right path, and that kind of show you some of the things that you need to find out more about to make sure that you're doing it in a way that works for you.
That's great. And for Zarak, so you download the book, you have it, you start interacting with it. Do you recommend, like, is this like kind of a cover to cover, like you're reading a little bit, you go in it in order, or are you jumping around based off of what's relevant to you, and you keep returning back to it? And is this something that your hope is that it's going to kind of stimulate some discussions with other members in the behavioral community? How do you see the best way to interact with what you and Laurel have put together?
I mean, really any of those would work. But I think as we were putting it together, we did sort of consciously think about that people might really only be interested in certain aspects of it, And so there are probably lots of people that would be interested in just sort of broadly in all of it. I think Laurel's made a great point that like, it's often helpful, I think, in behavioral science to get a little bit of like a view of the landscape, both from like the research perspective, like what even are the academic disciplines that comprise this field? And this is sort of the same, right? And that it's not meant to sort of tell you everything about everything, but like give you a sense of the landscape of this is kind of how a lot of organizations are using this, or how it could be used in a variety of places in organizations. So some people might be interested in that, where they want to get sort of this holistic sort of snapshot. Other people might just sort of say, hey, I'm a product person. I'm going to read the product chapter and I want to build a team. So I'm going to skip to the third section and read about how do I operationalize this stuff. And that's totally fine too. I mean, the things that we were thinking about in terms of accessibility was sort of not just cost, but also like, is this concise? We don't want something that is just sort of variations on a theme going on forever and ever, right? So it's like, we found folks that are experts in their domains, and they really kind of crystallized their a lot of their knowledge for this chapter. So it's meant to be something that you can read and understand pretty quickly, and you can of course choose elements of it that are more relevant to you. But I think my advice, I guess, as someone who has obviously at this point read all of it, is that there are useful insights from all of the chapters, and I think, we talked about the variety of perspectives and mandates that these different folks or different disciplines have. And I think that it's valuable to sort of see how different people are doing it, or how it's used in different practice areas, because you could, of course, borrow sort of lessons from those for your own. But, broadly, I think there isn't really like a wrong way to do it, but we tried to think about that sort of flexibility as we were pulling it all together.
And I think relatedly, Laurel, given that you've like interacted and been a part of behavioral science from so many different perspectives and angles, from academia and to kind of HR learning perspective, and to kind of what you're doing now at Edward Jones, if I'm interested in product management, I can go right to Kristen Berman's chapter. Or once you argue, like what Zarak is kind of saying, that I can probably glean some really important insights from other contributing chapter writers. And even though it may not be my domain area, I can say, oh yeah, I really need to think about that barrier or that consideration as I bring it back into product management.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are also, if you read multiple chapters, you see themes that kind of emerge across the chapters, which I think is really interesting because, the authors didn't get together and talk about what they were going to write. The fact that you see several people coming up with similar ideas is also helpful. Like one of the themes that stuck out to me was that one of the challenges of being a behavioral scientist is getting your ideas implemented. So people want you to come up with ideas, but almost regardless of where people work or in what capacity, if they're a consultant or if they're an employee or whatever, one of the challenges a lot of people have is pushing through that boundary of actually getting it implemented. So one of the authors talked about that as muscle. One of the chapters talked about that as in a survey result. That was one of the biggest challenges, so you kind of see themes throughout there, which are really useful because if you are part of a team or if you're building a team, you want to know like what good is all this work that we're doing if it doesn't actually impact the business. Like if we just get an insight and it doesn't change anything and it doesn't improve anything, what's the point of all of it? So that's a really important thing for you to go in knowing that I have to have a mechanism to make sure that the recommendations, as long as they're reasonable, are going to at least get tested, if not like fully implemented. That's just one example, but there were like a few themes like that I thought came out that are really interesting if you like read across chapters.
I think it's a really great point. Some of this may not be like really sexy stuff in terms of like structural barriers that you don't even think about, like when you're creating these units, having the data warehouses talk to each other, having to deal with legal and what you can and what you can't do once you've designed. You've moved from strategy towards the implementation side, making sure you have buy-in from the different components and divisions in that particular organization. There's a lot of those like next level details that are beyond just the behavioral science and the training. And it seems like we can get some really good tips and things to kind of keep in mind through these chapters. Zarak, are there any other themes that really stick out that you would, someone's taken a look at the book, they've read it, they've gone through it, any kind of like certain themes that really stick, at least from your reading interpretation as you put this together, that you kind of gleaned from this?
There are, I guess, sort of building a little bit on what Laurel just shared. I mean, there are some commonalities around challenges, and I would point maybe particularly to the research in the real world chapter, because I think that that's a thread that is going to run through almost every practice area. Is you're going to need to conduct research in some capacity. And I thought that Rochelle Martino did an awesome job with that chapter of sort of explaining these are kind of the steps. So this is how you sort of develop your research kind of along this path, and specific tools that are useful in different contexts, and so I think it's helpful because one of the things that she points out in that chapter is probably to some extent the organization's already conducting research, right? They may not think of themselves as researchers, but they're doing some kind of analysis, right? Even if it's just how many people are downloading the app, or how many clicks are we getting on this type of thing. So how do you sort of situate what they're already doing within sort of like the broader process or framework of what you want to do as you're sort of confirming hypotheses? And there's just a lot of really helpful, I think, kind of guidance in that chapter around language to use when you're sort of building your research kind of presence and capacity, trying to get buy-in from folks to run experiments. Laurel mentioned this earlier, just that's a real challenge. A lot of people don't anticipate, a lot of leaders maybe don't necessarily anticipate what research is going to entail. So how do you kind of bring people along on that journey and build that capacity is something that I think is a common theme throughout most behavioral work. And I thought that she did a great job of kind of capturing that. I think it's maybe in our longest chapter, but I think she did a great job of capturing that there.
It's really great. And let's talk about kind of the initial reception. So this book kind of came live just a few short days ago. You've got people like Aline Halsworth and Nir Ayel and Jeff Chrysler and me and others kind of mentioning how really amazing the book is and how valuable of a resource it is. What kind of reception? It's been on social media. It's been on Amazon. I've seen some posts. Maybe it's been doing pretty well, and the number of downloads on these websites. Are you getting some traction since the book has been made available for everybody?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when in my mind, I was like, so Laurel and I have spent hours and hours talking about intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation, right? I think this is very much, an exercise in intrinsic motivation, right? So this was something that was, I think, fun for us to do. I think fun for all of the authors. And there was a sense of purpose in the work too, right? So we kind of couched all of this and like, this is sort of for the good of the field. This is meant to be like a resource for folks that are making their way into behavioral science, or for people who are trying to build behavioral science within their organization. So that was really like the main kind of impetus for it. And in my mind, I was like, this is maybe going to be relevant for like, I don't know, 50 people, like how many people is this going to be relevant for? But, it's sort of even if it started as a passion project, yeah, the reception has been great. So it's kind of fun, like just seeing like folks who worked with over the last like several years, just kind of popping in to say that they appreciated it or liked it, or folks were sending us pictures of, like them with a copy of the book, which is like pretty cool. And then, yeah, there's sort of like the external validation of like, we had like a #1 new release on Amazon. So it's like, even Jeff Bezos thinks that it's cool. His algorithm does, at least. So yeah, no, it's been an awesome reception, and we've seen hundreds and hundreds of people actually already downloading it from the Action Design site, which is great. And then, obviously a bunch of people who have decided to buy it as well. So it kind of validated this approach of providing different options for people. So yeah, I mean, hopefully people are continue to find value there.
Yeah, I've had 2 people ask me for autographed copies already, and I asked them if they were joking, and they haven't answered. So
I've only had one, but it was my mom. So
that still counts. Counts.
Well, we can sign each other's, Zarak. That way they'll have a double.
Yeah, perfect.
There you go. I've been on 2 calls this week, and I've had people like hold up the book, like the physical hard copy of the book, and say, "Look what I have." And they've not admitted to actually reading it yet, but the fact that they have it in their presence, that is like step 1, right?
It's actually such a quick read, though. Honestly, I mean,
Yeah.
like Zarak said, we really there's that old adage. I don't know the quote, but it's something like, I would have written you a shorter letter, but I didn't have time, or something. Like, it can be harder to write things concisely, and so the fact that the people who authored the chapters have so much experience allowed them to kind of distill the really important concepts down and organize them in a way that makes sense. And so it really is a quick, pretty quick, accessible read.
I wonder if you download it by Kindle, if it actually tells you the number of hours it takes to read, like you would with any other Kindle book. It would be really interesting to see, like 1 hour, 48 minutes, you can
Yeah.
get through the book. So check into that. So where next? Like, now, I mean, this is an enormous accomplishment that you both did over a very short period of time. Where do you see going now that it's out there, that people are starting to respond to it and download it, or purchase the paperback? Where do you see this going, this knowledge going?
Amazon Prime has optioned it, so I think it's going to turn into, like a Lord of the Rings style film TV series.
Nice. So it's in a bidding war with Hulu or something.
Yeah, exactly,
there you go. All right.
Exactly. No, I mean, I think that this is sort of like, I don't know what the right term would be, mile marker, I guess, just sort of as the field continues to grow. So, I think as action design, and then I know that, for all three of us on the call, like we'll continue to look for ways to help just facilitate the further kind of growth of behavioral science, sort of professionalization of the field, and making it easier for people who are trying to kind of break into the field, right? So whether that's setting up a team or getting your first job as a behavioral scientist, I think that is sort of where we'll continue to sort of see or at least I'll continue to spend my time and effort. And I also wouldn't be surprised if at some point we did sort of like an updated version of this book. I mean, there's lots of other ideas and tactics and things that we could include. I think we could probably build out a section a little bit more robustly around, or a little bit more of a robust section around like government organizations. They kind of get a lot of behavioral science teams started in government. So there's kind of a lot of attention there already. That's partly why we didn't spend as much time there, but I think we could probably revisit that. So I wouldn't be surprised if we sort of expanded at some point with a few, additional chapters. And one thing that we had in here originally, and then we kind of decided to release later because we didn't finish it, was like a hiring guide, basically. So, we sort of say the chapters have sort of like what you're looking for in terms of a behavioral scientist in different areas, but almost like a kind of companion booklet, that's like, here's sort of a sample job description. And, these questions come up all the time about, does somebody need a PhD or not? Or does somebody need this skill set or not? And that is, I think, different for different roles. And, so that's sort of the idea, is to bring a little bit more nuance to it and not just sort of say like, yeah, you always need a PhD in stats or whatever to be a behavioral scientist. So I could see that being another sort of next step for us here.
I think
you, Laurel, what do you think? What's next?
Yeah.
What's next for you?
Well, so what's next for me personally, I can talk about in a minute. I was going to say, with respect to the book, in terms of like future chapters and things like that, one thing that we didn't really get to, and it might not have fit with the like feel of this book, but that would be an interesting follow-up, is sort of like lessons learned, which could be useful both for people who are going into behavioral science, into these roles, and people who are kind of on the outside hiring them or working with them, to have that in their mind. But it would be great to get together with the people who authored these chapters and some other behavioral scientists and kind of put our heads together and say, like, here are a few things that I think about on a daily basis that are like either challenges or opportunities, or I was amazed that this worked, and kind of get a feel for like, that's my idiosyncratic experience. But if you can get 20 or 25 people around saying like, yeah, I've been in a couple places and that's pretty common, or I think that could be really useful. One of the things that Zarak touched on that I'm pretty like, I would definitely want to talk about in that context, is the idea that oftentimes people ask the behavioral scientist to do something at the end of a decision. Like, we have an email campaign, optimize the email. Try 5 different versions of the email and see how many people click on it. And that's fine. But oftentimes, like, the longer you're in the industry, the more you realize that the decisions that happen way before that, like, what are you offering to them? And, is it worth their time? And who is it coming from? There are so many other things that have an impact on whether people are going to respond to that email that are not part of the copy in the email. And so we reference that a couple times in the book as sort of like the meatier, earlier, more like sort of psychological and environmental decisions, as opposed to like the nudges that happen at the very end of a user experience. But that, I think, is like such an interesting and rich topic for any business to explore if they really want to, like, as a behavioral scientist, ultimately we're supposed to talk about what drives behavior. And it's not just the copy in an email, it's lots of other stuff. And so I think and hope that the field moves more in that direction of involving behavioral scientists and more of those kind of bigger decisions.
That's a really great point, that it's behavioral science is about strategy, implementation, and evaluation, that there's multiple components there that this knowledge can really be useful for. And even the designing of these implementations, really important to make sure that you're not throwing 7 different variables out there and you don't know what's driving the change. Being able to kind of do an autopsy on these campaigns to see what worked and what didn't work, and what's the data say, so that can inform the next time, before you even get to the email marketing campaign, what are the factors that go into it at the very beginning. So there's a lot of layers that behavioral science can tackle. And it sounds like there's a lot that can be mined from this book, and follow-ups and then discussions going forward. I think I'm not letting the cat out of the bag, that this is probably not the only episode that we'll be doing related to this book. While this might be my only hosting gig out of it, there's a lot more for us to talk about that I'm really excited. So Zarak, can you talk a little bit more about like what's next beyond this just kind of initial overview of the book that you and Laurel created?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that kind of knocked it out of the park the first time with this hosting. So I don't know that I would write it off too quickly. That
all right, sorry,
call
Eric.
on you,
See
call
you
on you
later.
again. You're exactly right. So that is kind of our plan, is over the next few months to release podcast episodes with different folks who contributed. So it wouldn't have been possible without just the awesome expertise and knowledge and generosity of the authors who really wrote the book. And so we'll spend some time with them, kind of talking about what they wrote, but then it'll also give us a little bit more opportunity to, kind of riff and just go in different directions. And they're all very interesting people who have had interesting careers and a lot to share. So that's exactly right. That's sort of our plan, is to do sort of a series of some action design podcasts, as well as maybe host some events that people can join and participate and ask questions and that sort of thing. So yeah, more to come on that, but that's what the next few months will look like for us related to this book.
I think it's going to be fun to get that next level reaction, to get people's reaction, like what Laurel was saying too, like getting them to take a minute to like read some of these chapters, to digest it and get what they have to say and what they think is a next step. I get really excited about bringing some of these different people that wrote these chapters together and really unpacking some of these themes, getting them to react to each other's pieces, and hearing what the collective wisdom among the many members of the behavioral science community, what they have to say when they take a look at the various chapters in this book.
Yeah.
Laurel, any like concluding thoughts or anything that you want to share about this book and the process?
Just that I really appreciate the people who contributed to the book. I know that this was something that, as Zarak said, it's something that is pretty near and dear to people's hearts when you are in a field that so much of your passion and interest and way of viewing the world is wrapped up in your job as a behavioral scientist. And so I think it was a really cool opportunity for people to contribute, but everyone really just brought great work and insight and ideas to the book. And it was just a really fun and collaborative experience. So I hope that that's representative of the way that the field, continues. It's a pretty collaborative, open, where people like to help each other. And so just, I hope that's the way things continue. And if you are a behavioral scientist, let's try to kind of keep the momentum going.
That's great. Keep the momentum going. I'm excited to have people react and see what happens next. Really grateful for the opportunity to talk to both of you today and to share this resource with a broader community through Action Design Network and Penn's Master of Behavioral and Decision Science program. So I'm grateful to have done this with both of you and talk through this, and excited for more conversations to follow.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. That concludes this edition of Action Design Radio, hosted by Eric Johnson and Zarak Khan. All podcast episodes are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and many other platforms where you might typically get your pod on. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Special thanks to Morgan Bortz for design, and as always, we would like to recognize Steve Wendell, founder of the Action Design Network, a nonprofit organization dedicated to spreading awareness about behavioral economics, psychology, and all things behavioral science in order to help you improve your life, your career, and your understanding of the world around us and the people in it. I am your producer and audio engineer, Zach Simon. For more cutting-edge behavioral science content, visit action-design.org. Once again, that's action-design.org. There, you can sign up for our newsletter and find an in-person event happening near you. We have chapters in over a dozen cities in the United States and Canada. Also, on our website, you can find additional notes and links regarding the topics discussed in today's episode. Thank you again for tuning in, and we will see you again soon.